Hi everyone, welcome to the next part of the Red Mars read-along. We've just finished part 6 of the book, and if you're still reading along with me, then fantastic. If you're not reading along and you're just watching the video to recap on what you've read before, or just to see what's going on in the series without having to read it, then welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on this. I'm having a ball with this book. Let's just jump right into the recap. Our opening spiel this time is people recounting where they were and what was happening when they heard that John Boone, the first man on Mars, the de facto leader of the first 100, was assassinated. The stories quickly take on a mythical, apocryphal vibe, with people talking about crops being flash frozen at the instant of his death, or the man himself bursting into flames when he died. John Boone had grown into a very mythical figure by this point, and his death has done nothing to lessen that. It's very clear from these stories that John Boone was an important person to a lot of people, and perhaps to the planet as a whole, and that his loss was sorely felt across the entire world. In this part, we're following Frank Chalmers again. This is, I believe, a very short while after he's orchestrated the assassination of John Boone, and he is deep at work organising the ratification of the new Mars Treaty. The situation on Earth is dire. The new anti-aging treatment has brought everything there to a head. Everything there is a tinderbox ready to ignite. In a planet that was already struggling with overpopulation, already struggling with massive inequality, with massive differences in wealth and lifestyle opportunities, the ability for the richest nations and the richest people among them to now perhaps live very extended lifetimes, perhaps forever, and this treatment being kept from the poorer countries and the poorer citizens, has brought everything to a head, and riots and violence are breaking out across the globe. Starvation and illness claim many lives. Famine and starvation is almost seen as the solution to this problem, the solution to the overpopulation. That the poorer countries will just start to die out from famine, and that will leave more land and resources for the new, richer people with their extended lifetimes. This part of the book hits really hard. I think I said it in the last part, but I would absolutely read a whole series that is just the events during this time on Earth. There's already so much inequality in our world. If we added to that, when we add to that the ability to extend one's lifetime, and if that is restricted to those same wealthy elite that currently hoard so much wealth, I can only imagine the sort of violence and spite and anger and vitriol that would break out. It's probably the scariest and also most believable part of this entire novel so far, is just the level of anger that would rage across the entire planet. It might finally be the thing that tips people over. Frank is in meetings all day, every day at the Treaty Ratification Summit. There are representatives from all the signatory nations, as well as non-voting representatives from people from Mars, community leaders and representatives, as well as many representatives and executives from the big transnational corporations, who obviously have a lot weighing on getting their investment back out of the Martian colonies, of being able to put their money in and take investment money back out. There are huge pushes to allow more immigration to Mars. A lot of the countries on Earth seem to see Mars as their pressure valve for this overpopulation crisis that they're dealing with. Frank takes two of the most hard-hit countries, China and India, aside and talks to them. He says, emigration to Mars isn't going to solve your problem. You will never be able to put enough people on ships to come to Mars to lessen the overpopulation problem that they're having. And what they really need is they need a bigger share of the money that is being drawn out of Mars, and that with that money they can start to reclaim the land and reclaim the resources that they already have on Earth. The representatives from China and India agree with him in a way that makes it seem clear that this, despite all their posturing about immigration, was what they were after the whole time. Frank's private talk with the Chinese and Indian representatives becomes famous as a turning point in these negotiations. It takes months from that point on to narrow down the exact figures and values of the new treaty, but from that moment on it became clear that they were kind of all working towards the same goal. And the treaty eventually comes out very much unchanged from the original treaty, with minor changes here and there, and really limiting the power of the transnational corporations on Mars and giving it back to the signatory countries. And interestingly enough, it looks a lot like the sort of treaty that John Boone was pushing for. So for Frank, it seems maybe it wasn't so much a question of how John Boone was going to run the planet, but more that he didn't want it to be John Boone running the planet. He wanted it to be Frank Chalmers. Very quickly, it becomes apparent that these transnational corporations aren't just going to sit back and let this treaty block their access. They begin partnering up with some of the weaker and poorer countries that are signatories to the treaty, setting up essentially flags of convenience. One of them partners up with the Ethiopian contingent, saying that they're planning on moving their headquarters to Ethiopia. This happens again and again, these big transnationals basically moving into these weaker, poorer countries in exchange for massive amounts of resources given to the government and people of these countries, being able to use their status as signatory countries to be able to continue doing what they need to do on Mars. The treaty may have blocked transnationals out from being able to operate on Mars and create mining bases on Mars, but it doesn't stop the signatory countries. Through all of this, we're back dealing with Maya. With John out of the way, Maya is back to wanting to be with Frank and being in love with Frank. And Frank is struggling with this relationship. It's what he'd always wanted, but now that he has so much power, he can't let himself believe that Maya wants him for him. He can't believe that someone with as much power as he has can have friends, can have relationships, without those people just wanting something, the use of his power, proximity to his power, resources, money, land from him. After a particularly bad dream about John Boone really stoking the guilt that Frank is beginning to feel about his role in the murder of John Boone, he wakes up and sparks an argument off with Maya. Maya storms out of the room and leaves. Frank feels lost and numb after the treaty signing. He doesn't attend the party celebrating the treaty. He wanders to himself. He's in that sort of mood that I think a lot of us might have felt at the end of a project or event that you've put your whole body and soul into, when it's finally over and you're just sort of left with this numb what now feeling. Frank is walking around in this melancholy, worrying about how ineffectual the treaty may be, with the transnationals already seeming to sidestep it, worrying about his guilt over the death of John, worrying over his role in this treaty, worrying about all the deals and lies and deceit he's had to play to get it signed. And eventually he just decides to go traveling. He needs time away. He needs time away from his role as the US representative on Mars. He ends up traveling with a Bedouin Muslim caravan. This is a group of families who are all traveling together in these large trailers and caravans with these big surface mining vehicles that they've edited and manufactured to their specifications, and they travel the surface of the planet, looking for and mining the sort of mineral deposits that are close to the surface that are just a bit too small for the big transnational and government-run mining operations to bother setting up a permanent mine. This chapter has a lot of super interesting observations and discussions about like the Islamic faith and Muslim people in general that might have been my favourite part of this entire bit. It was really fascinating listening to how they lived and Frank's thoughts as an outsider as he got more and more entwined in this group. Studies of religion and religious people has always been really interesting to me. It's always been a fascinating topic. But I'm nowhere near an expert and I don't feel qualified to really comment on a lot of what was said in this chapter. Suffice to say, I think it was really interesting, it was really eye-opening, and I really enjoyed it. But as for dissecting this book's representation of Islamic people, I think I'll leave that to people who are much, much smarter than I am. During his time with the caravan, Frank finds himself being very calmed and soothed by his solo prospecting trips. He takes out one of the prospecting vehicles and goes out searching for these mineral deposits on his own, for sometimes weeks at a time. And it's during this time that he begins to learn how to act as though no one is watching him, as though for the first time in his life no one is there judging him. He talks to himself, he reads books, he writes, he journals. Sometimes he watches the news, slowly that fades off as he becomes more engrossed in the moment and within his own head. Eventually this takes a sinister turn though as he starts to have nightmares, again about John Boone, a bit about Maya, but mostly about his guilt. One day the caravan visits an American-run mining colony. The miners there don't know who John is, but he's clearly important, and they talk to him. And they talk to him of the situation on Mars. And it becomes clear to Frank quite quickly how out of touch he's grown. It's been nearly 2 years that he's been travelling with the caravan. Just a side note, I continue to be vexed by the use of the word years in this book. I'm never sure whether it's talking about Martian years or human years, and it seems when it's describing passages of time or people are talking about how long things have been, it seems like they use the terms interchangeably without making any note of what it is. I, at this point, have no idea how long first 100 have been on Mars. I can't keep track of it in my head anymore because of how often it's been mentioned in human years and how often it's been mentioned in Martian years. It's definitely the thing that is annoying me the most in this book, and the thing that just one simple clear up, like if they just put like an M in front of the word year when they meant Martian years or something like that, I would be so happy. Maybe I'm just an idiot. If anyone else is having an issue with this, let me know. But the time frames that's going on, especially with how many time jumps we've had, has been a real struggle to keep clear in my head. Anyway, the miners tell Frank about how there are tens of thousands of new immigrants arriving on Mars, most of them arriving on work plans and via methods that the treaty terms illegal. But it seems that the big transnationals have managed to sidestep the treaty again, perhaps even bribing and buying out members of the UN, so that the UN, who is supposed to be enforcing this treaty, just isn't. The miners talk to him about how they're supposed to have time in the gyms so that they can continue working out, so that after their hard stay of hard manual labor on Mars, they can return to Earth with this huge paycheck. But they lament that many of them don't think they'll actually get back to Earth. They think that the time that's been allocated by the transnationals to be used in the gym isn't going to be sufficient for their body to be able to return to Earth's gravity. They talk to Frank about how entire colonies, entire mining groups, entire work groups are disappearing after these hidden colonies seemingly run by the likes of ℙ𝕚𝕚 and 𝕚𝕚, and that more and more people are just waiting in these terrible conditions to find out how they can defect to these other groups. Frank recognises this for what it is. It could very well be the beginning of a Martian revolution. He decides it's time that he returns from his sabbatical. He must return to his work as the US representative on Mars. Frank rushes back to his office, and the first thing he does is he packs everyone up and moves them to the site of the space elevator. Knowing that the space elevator is soon to be completed, he knows that this area is going to soon become the central hub of governance, trade, immigration, emigration, law and order. Everything important is going to be revolved around the base of the space elevator. The space elevator touches down at 𝕚𝕚, its base being secured to the planet via giant electromagnets. Within days of the cable setting down, the elevator is operational. Giant cargo loads are being shipped off for trips back to Earth. People are coming down from the asteroid floating overhead to come and emigrate into Mars. And this immigration, this ease of immigration, this cheapness of immigration, poses immediate and far-reaching issues for the people of Mars. Tent cities, the likes of which John Boone was assassinated in, begin popping up all around the base of 𝕚𝕚. They're separated by race or by nationality. They're separated by which transnational corporation they work for. And all of them have similar problems. That is that crime, mistreatment, and violence become epidemic problems within these cities. The private security forces sent by the transnationals that are supposed to deal with these issues, that are supposed to police crime, are little more than extortionist racketeers. More and more people begin disappearing to these hidden colonies as several large, important tent cities begin to strike. Frank tries to control the situation. He talks to the striking citizens. He travels to all the different tent cities that are having issues and learns about their problems. He learns about the mistreatment and the attacks that are happening on behalf of the security forces. It's clear to him that the transnational corporations are trying to escalate violence, and in some places they've succeeded. Their security forces have come in posing as other members, caused violence, and then the victims have lashed out against the UN security forces, therefore involving a third party, making it look like the citizens are the ones that are causing the violence. Frank calls them idiots, that they've walked right into this trap, and that they don't understand the predicament they're in. They don't understand how easy it is to force strikers to return to work in Mars. They don't understand how fragile their position is, how things like life support, food, and water can just be switched off at a whim, how the transnationals and the governments back on Earth have giant militaries that they could very easily ship out to Mars now, bring them down the space elevator, and enforce their will. He says that if you think that back on Earth is a police state, it's even easier to enforce here. And that the only way we're going to get anything done properly is if we form into committees, if we document the violence and the crimes that are being committed, and we try and prove that they're breaking the treaty, and we bring this out in a public forum. Frank's plan here seems to be partly about solving the crisis, but mostly about making sure that he's the one that's in control when the crisis is solved, that he's the one that will get the benefit and the accolades for solving these issues. Many of the colonists that Frank talks to during this time are talking of revolutionary ideas. they're comparing themselves to the Americas just before the American Revolution, saying that they're just waiting for their George Washington, their Thomas Jefferson to arrive to lead them into this glorious revolution. During the height of this revolutionary talk, Frank hears that the city of Nicosia, the city where he orchestrated the death of John Boone, has been taken over by 𝕐𝕠 and had labelled itself as an independent city-state. Learning that 𝕐𝕠 and Nadia are apparently in Nicosia in person, Frank and Maya travel there together. Side note, Maya's back with Frank at this point. I haven't touched on the Maya stuff a lot in this chapter because I'm kind of sick of it. I feel like in part 2, I want to say, where they were on board the Ares, Maya was just a fantastic character. I really liked her struggles with leadership, dealing with her emotional responses. I loved her struggles with 𝕐𝕠 and Frank and John. But it feels like ever since they got to Mars, Maya's role has just been the lady that's on John or Frank's arm, and she hasn't seemed to have a lot of agency or purpose to herself, and it's kind of disappointed me. So I'm just mostly just ignoring her role at this point, which is sad, but that's what it is. But anyway, she's here. Arriving in Nicosia, they find that neither 𝕐𝕠 nor Nadia are here. Perhaps they've been lured here under false pretenses. And it's while talking to 𝕐𝕠 on the phone that he learns that Nadia and 𝕐𝕠 don't seem to be agreeing on much right now. And 𝕐𝕠 seems to have been a bit radical for Nadia, and Nadia can't control him. Frank tells 𝕐𝕠 that he's mad. He can't seriously mean to cause a revolution, and he can't seriously think that he'd win one. But 𝕐𝕠 just tells him that he absolutely means to win one, and then ends the call. While walking in the park in Nicosia, a man calls out to Frank, a short man that Frank might recognise but can't quite place. The man says to Frank that last time he saw him in Nicosia, it was Frank that was causing trouble. It was Frank that was trying to cause violence, and it was Frank that was bringing the city down. But now, it's his turn. Before Frank can do anything, the man rushes off. Frank and Maya race to the city manager's office to try and warn them, and it's while they're inside the building that alarms begin ringing, that doors begin locking and sealing, and looking out the window, they notice that the tent city, the tent itself, the big plastic sheeting bubble that keeps the atmosphere in, has been breached in several places. The buildings have locked themselves and sealed themselves to keep what little atmosphere they have inside safe, while people outside on the street bang on doors, bang on windows, claw at their throats and collapse to the ground, suffocating. The Martian Revolution has begun, and it's begun with violence. Okay, I said in my last part that part was my least favourite so far. This is probably my favourite so far. I love dealing with the political stuff. I love dealing with the transnational corporations. That's what I'm in this book for, and it is glorious. Seeing a bit more about what's going back on Earth with the anti-aging treatment is fantastic. As I've said, that might be the most interesting thing that's going on in this book, and the situation back on Earth is just so very believable. I mentioned it just before, I'm really disappointed. I continue to be disappointed with Maya's role in the story now. I feel like she was such a fantastic, smart, strong character that being reduced to the love interest that seems to flip back and forth between John and Frank kind of disappointed me. She's still interesting, she's still kind of strong, she's definitely not independent, she's definitely not got a lot of agency in the story anymore. I feel like there would be a lot of interesting things you could do with Maya now. She was meant to be the Russian leader of the original expedition, and that role seems to have kind of been taken over by 𝕐𝕠. And dealing with that situation would have been really interesting from either of their points of view. And maybe it'll come up in the next part, but I'm not holding my breath at this point. But continuing with the feelings of inadequacy and leadership that Maya was feeling in part 2, and moving towards 𝕐𝕠 taking over that leadership would have been an interesting emotional point for her. But I've talked enough about Maya. The talks of transnational corporations just sort of running hotshot over the smaller, weaker countries so that they can get by the treaty is fantastic. I love that. That is just so obviously what would happen. I find that so believable and just so scary how close we kind of would be in the world right now to a situation like that, where like a giant corporation would just move to a smaller, weaker country and then basically buy it. The workers complaining about the conditions on Mars really feels like those old mining company towns where they're being paid in, company credits, shopping at the company store. You can't leave because all your savings are in company bucks, they're not in dollars. And here it's just amplified because you can't leave because outside is poisonous. And if you're not careful and if you don't keep up with your exercise, you can't even go back to Earth at the end of it. And then what's going to happen? Is your money even good on Mars? The idea of economics on Mars hasn't been touched on a lot, I feel. I feel a lot of people are talking about making money for when they're back on Earth, but I feel like we haven't talked a lot about what the monetary and economic situation actually is on Mars right now. Like, are people paying rent, buying food, or is that provided? Is that like sort of a socialist thing that's going on Mars right now? Or, because like it definitely was back when they were just a small scientific community, but I feel like they haven't touched on it that much as we've expanded to this 1 million+ citizen strong planet. And that could be a really interesting place to take the story. I'd really love to hear more about that. I'm really excited to hear about this revolution. Finally, it seems like we've been taking use of all those hidden colonies that John Boone was shown by Arcades' men that clearly he didn't tell Frank about. And we've started with violence. This feels like it's going to be something Arcady orchestrated, not Hiroka. Hiroka doesn't seem like the violent sort to me. So I'm going to be really interested. I'm hoping in the next part we follow Arcady as our viewpoint character, because I really want to know if this violence that's taken off was because of him, if he orchestrated it, or if it's a splinter group, a radical young splinter group. Most of the first 100 are older now. Frank was talking in this bit about how some of the people coming to Mars were born after he left Earth, that like he knows Earth that their grandparents knew. That's kind of how the age difference is now. For a little bit during the last chapter, I was kind of not jiving with the book. I was kind of not loving myself. But this chapter sparked my interest again. And along with this chapter and some of the lovely comments that I've gotten, by the way, if you've commented on any of these videos, thank you so much. If you're still watching, thank you so much. This sort of thing, this reading a book and discussing it chapter by chapter, that's why I started this channel. These videos obviously don't get as many views because not everyone's reading the book, and they're a bit more work to make, but I really enjoy making them, and hearing from people, even just, you know, hearing that you've watched it, hearing that you enjoyed it, that's really touching and means a lot to me. And those people that are giving advice or recommendations or just feedback in general is really appreciated. As I was saying, because of the comments I've gotten and because of how much I'm enjoying this book, I've gone ahead and ordered Green Mars and Blue Mars, and after I think a couple weeks break, after we finish Red Mars, I will start off with the next one, start off with Green Mars. So let me know in the comments if you're going to continue reading with me after we finish this book. Let me know in the comments what you think is going to come next. Personally, I can't see the Transnationals just standing by while the revolution takes place on Mars. I think there's going to either turn out to have been already security forces here from them in large numbers, or they're going to start shipping them out soon. And I think with the space elevator in the hands of the Transnationals, the revolution is going to have a real struggle keeping them off the planet. So I think the revolution is going to have to try and claim and gain control of the space elevator. So there are technically 2 parts of the book left, but there is only, I think, 99 or 101 pages left. So I'm excited to read it. I'm on a roll. I think the next video is just going to be the remainder of the book, the last 100 pages. That sticks to our kind of 100 pages-ish video that we were going for. And that should bring us to a wrap in a couple weeks' time. Thank you again so much for watching if you still are. If you want to support the channel at all, there's affiliate links in the description below where you can pick up copies of these books. If you want to support the channel even more, we now have channel memberships. There's nothing super special going on right now, but if you want to support the channel, they're there. But thank you so much, and remember, keep reading.